Transmigrated as a disabled protagonist, how should I continue the script? Chapter 19, Corruption. Yumino Kyusaku had just been brought back to the port mafia and was immediately placed in a solitary confinement cell. Barring any accidents, this would be his residence from now on. Until he could gain control over his ability, neither the port mafia nor the special division would allow this child to be released. Having accomplished this task, Tezuka Osamu sat in a small clinic, holding a cup of instant noodles while watching a horror movie. Today's film, Mermaid in a Manhole. Yakimaru sat beside him, but the dark, gloomy scenes of the film were completely lost on a blind person. At first, the black-haired youth had his hands resting on his knees, sitting normally. However, within a few minutes, he had taken off his shoes, crossed his arms, and entered a blank state of mind, sitting on the sofa as if he were deeply engrossed in the movie. Mori Ogai, originally intending to praise Dazaikun, turned his head and was stopped in his tracks by the grotesque image on the TV. The mermaid's belly was rotting, covered in pustules and tumors. What a disturbing sight. He struggled to swallow his noodles, finding them tasteless as wax. Dazaikun, watching this while eating isn't the best idea. Even though Mori Ogai wasn't particularly interested in horror films, he had at least heard of this one's notorious reputation. Elise had been so frightened that she vanished, unwilling to watch the movie with them any longer. "I'm working on improving my tolerance," Tezuka Osamu said, expressionless as he continued watching. He found the film incredibly disgusting, but it didn't really affect him much. What did you want to say, Mori-san?" Mori Ogai hurriedly finished his noodles and tossed the cup into the trash, regaining his usual inscrutable demeanor. "You brought Yumino back. Is there any reward you would like?" "Reward?" Upon hearing this, Tezuka Osamu raised his hand. "Mori-san personally preparing a painless poison. That would bring boundless joy." Mori Ogai politely declined, "I'm worried that Yaki-kun might want to kill me." "What does my preference have to do with him?" Tezuka Osamu said, but as he spoke, sitting beside him Yakimaru looked toward him. Then, without warning, Tezuka grabbed a cushion and placed it in front of Yakimaru's face to cover his eyes. "Pick something else," Mori Ogai said sincerely. "Fix Yakimaru's face," Tezuka Osamu said from the heart. Mori Ogai pondered for a moment before offering a realistic suggestion. "Full facial reconstruction and skin grafting techniques aren't advanced enough to fool your eyes. You're better off keeping him with the mask on." Tezuka Osamu slumped his shoulders and went back to watching the movie. Suddenly, the grotesque image of the pus-filled sores triggered a strange sense of exhilaration in him. Slowly, he glanced at Yakimaru and couldn't help but think, Yakimaru doesn't seem that ugly, does he? As an adult, Mori Ogai was amused by Tezuka Osamu's behavior. Don't always be so critical of Yaki-kun's appearance. He'll be hurt, and besides, his face can come in handy at crucial moments. Tezuka Osamu pondered, to scare people. Mori Ogai, misleading him, said, "Just imagine, at the critical moment of a fight, he takes off the mask." A light bulb went off in Tezuka Osamu's head. That would be a guaranteed win. The teacher and his student, both full of dark humor, while Yakimaru, who had been mocked, slowly emerged from his simple meditative state. The distracting thoughts that he had suppressed began to rise again, bringing back the images from Dogra Magra. The more he thought about it, the images in his memory seemed to be fading. Yakimaru couldn't grasp the once vibrant colors that were slipping away, as if the world was drifting away from his sight. He sank into a quiet melancholy. Blindness itself was not terrifying, what was truly terrifying was the blindness of the heart. In his long-term isolation, Yakimaru had lost his sensitivity to beauty, his ability to imagine vivid images, and could only sense that he was contemplating something. In the real world, he might even apply for a Guinness World Record. Something like, physically disabled but mentally resilient. As Yakimaru sank into his melancholy, the conversation in the outside world came to an end. Tezuka Osamu secured the right to visit Yumino Kyusaku once a week from Mori-san, on the condition that he ensured Yumino wouldn't be subjected to intense stimuli. Mori Ogai, as if suddenly remembering something, asked in confusion, I had a brief exchange with Yumino-kun, and he mentioned wanting a cute puppet. Was he referring to Yaki-kun? Yakimaru's appearance, with his cold, refined features and tall, slender figure, had never aligned with anything remotely cute. Tezuka Osamu remained silent. In front of Mori Ogai, he removed Yakimaru's mask and, with a deadpan expression, said, this is the kind of cute he meant. 2 hollow black eye sockets, a sunken nose, and stark white teeth. This was a face cursed by demons. In an unexpected situation, it could indeed be a form of psychological warfare. Mori Ogai, his composure shattered by the extreme sight before him, covered his eyes. Tezuka-kun, weren't you always reluctant to take off his mask? Why don't you mind now? Tezuka Osamu remained calm. No one knows what I've been through. From being unable to look directly at it, to barely accepting it, who knows how many shocks he had endured in between. Yakimaru snatched back the mask from Dororo in Tezuka's hand, feeling a bit emotional. I'm ugly. Tezuka Osamu was stunned and looked over at the now ignored Yakimaru. With his mask back on, Yakimaru rested his head on his knees, as if aware of how hideous his appearance was, and seemed deeply saddened. Mori Ogai gently said, if Yaki-kun hadn't gone through what he did, with such keen intelligence, he would surely be someone just as remarkable as Tezuka-kun. Mori Ogai, with a pointed tone, added, and if it were Tezuka-kun. Tezuka Osamu immediately replied, I'd choose to go and die. Thus, the conversation came to an abrupt end. During this time spent with Tezuka Osamu, Yakimaru, who had an automatic patrol function once the doors were closed, stood up, put on his shoes, and slowly began walking toward the exit. Tezuka Osamu didn't immediately follow, raising an eyebrow instead. Mori Ogai teased, you should keep an eye on Yaki-kun's mental state. Tezuka Osamu rolled his eyes. Mori-san, I'm not a leprechaun, and I don't have any weird object fixations. Mori Ogai ignored the remark from the young troublemaker, flipping through the contract in his hand. I've heard that the Sheep King has been searching for him near Suribachi Street. My clinic is still relatively close to that area. Tezuka Osamu pulled out a pair of earphones from his pocket, put them on, and indifferently continued watching his movie. An hour later, he cursed under his breath, damn it, Jinx. He quickly got up and rushed out. In the clinic, Mori Ogai rested his hand against his lips, chuckling softly. It seems the Sheep King has a lot of interest in Yaki-kun. Tezuka-kun, you'd better keep an eye on him yourself, or else, he might easily be snatched away by someone else. On his legs was a GPS tracker, his clothes were lined with wiretaps, and his body carried who knows how many strange devices. Yet, Yakimaru walking outside didn't attract any unusual attention. At most, he was just wearing a yukata, wooden sandals, with a samurai sword once tied to his waist now detached and replaced with prosthetic arms. The black-haired youth in the yukata walked with extreme steadiness, his hollow eyes giving off a subtle sense of a distance that could not tolerate even a grain of sand. He was searching for something. In this world where humans and demons coexisted, he was hunting down evil. Nakahara Chuya, hiding behind a corner, didn't dare to poke his head out. He quickly signaled to the informant ahead, all right, you go now. The target of the bribery was a street urchin from Suribachi Street. Though feeling the payment was a bit low, he could only swallow his complaints about the extortion and move on. As he walked, he glanced at the corner where Nakahara Chuya was hiding. The figure, wearing a hooded coat and not daring to show his face, didn't seem like the imposing Sheep King at all. Instead, he looked more like a stalker or a creepy follower. Nakahara Chuya waited until Yakimaru reached the next street before breathing a sigh of relief and quickly following. After tracking for this long, he had figured out one key rule when tailing Yakimaru: never expose himself in an open area without cover. Otherwise, Yakimaru would instantly sense his presence. His interest in Yakimaru wasn't merely simple curiosity, but rather a deep yearning to uncover the mysteries of his own origins through the other. Such a tragic appearance. Could it be caused by that explosion 6 years ago? Nakahara Chuya was anxious. It might sound unbelievable to others, but Nakahara Chuya was not entirely human. His consciousness was born from the explosion 6 years ago. That incident had covered a vast area, scorching the earth and reddening the sky. Released in that moment was Arahabaki, taking the form of a black, menacing beast, wreaking havoc on the land. He didn't know why he, an incarnate of a calamity god, had a human form, with immense power sealed within him. Yet, he couldn't find the reason for his existence, ultimately appearing as a 7-year-old child wandering the streets of Suribachi. During his battle with Yakimaru, a faint red aura surrounded Yakimaru's body, visible only to him. It was a power strikingly similar to Arahabaki's. Yakimaru walked through the deserted streets of Yokohama, moving farther from the crowd, and into areas devoid of passers-by. In these parts of Yokohama, the absence of people also meant a lack of surveillance cameras, making it a dangerous place. Nakahara Chuya knew he shouldn't worry about Yakimaru, but he still found himself sweating for him. After all, Yakimaru was both blind and deaf. When crossing the street, Yakimaru couldn't see the traffic lights at all. When someone eyed him with ill intent, Yakimaru acted as if he didn't notice. But when they passed by, his uncompromising aura, like someone who couldn't tolerate even a grain of sand in his eyes, made the person hesitate, too afraid to speak. He briefly pulled out a small knife before putting it away again. Whenever there was an obstacle ahead, Yakimaru instinctively avoided it or stepped over it, the wooden geta sandals making a soft cracking sound with each step. Occasionally, his foot would crush a piece of shattered glass. He moved like a ghost from an ancient city through the bustling modern streets, cold, strange, and burdened with heavy obsessions. No one could comprehend the world seen through his eyes. Nakahara Chuya followed Yakimaru, hands tucked into his pockets, maintaining a safe distance. His tension gradually turned into a heavy feeling. Compared to Yakimaru, wasn't he, too, wandering aimlessly in the streets of Suribachi? Both were like people without purpose, searching for something elusive. Yakimaru's range of activity centered around this clinic, ensuring that he could return afterward, with no intention of straying too far from Dororo. This city had a strange, sinister atmosphere. Plenty of people had life flames glowing red, yet true malevolent entities were scarce. Yakimaru, using himself as bait, wanted to slay as many evil beings as possible while Dororo was not by his side. He had come to realize that the more evil beings he killed, the stronger his body became. Perhaps, the next time, he might even be able to hold his breath for longer without suffocating. Ahead of Yakimaru, a strange scene unfolded. An elderly grandmother, visiting relatives from Kanagawa and getting lost in Yokohama, wandered into a secluded area where no passers-by were in sight. Spotting the solitary figure of Yakimaru, she approached, intending to ask him for directions. Without a hint of expression, Yakimaru simply walked around this human obstacle and continued on his way. The grandmother muttered, "What a strange child." Following behind, Nakahara Chuya sighed in exasperation. A moment later, he hurried over to help the grandmother, pointing out the direction. "Granny, head that way, and be careful. Don't go down deserted alleys." After settling that, Nakahara Chuya rushed in the direction Yakimaru had gone. Suddenly, he came to an abrupt stop. Just behind a wall, Yakimaru was quietly waiting for him, his left hand resting on his right arm, poised to draw the sharp sword from beneath the vividly embroidered, firework patterned sleeve. Coloring changing demon god, we meet again. Unlike their first encounter months ago, the red glow around him had dimmed slightly. However, the core of that aura remained a deep, blood red, so dark it bordered on black, radiating a violent and evil energy. It was the aura of a demon god, not a human. Nakahara Chuya sighed, "Can't fool you, huh? Why is it that every time we meet, it's either a fight or a chase? Is there no way for us to have a normal conversation?" The only silver lining was that Yakimaru hadn't struck with his sword right away, he was waiting for Chuya to make a move. That must be a sign of caution toward him. Nakahara Chuya pulled back his hood, revealing his bright, fiery hair being tousled by the wind. His diamond-like blue eyes held a determined resolve. Even if the sheep had fractured, the Sheep King of Suribachi Street would not be looked down upon by anyone. He had earned his reputation through his own strength, and he had never abused his power to bully or oppress anyone on Suribachi Street. Many who possess pure white flames are likely not as kind-hearted as Nakahara Chuya, whose flame burns a deep red. People, like abilities, exist within the sorrow of corruption. Yakimaru could not understand Nakahara Chuya's sorrow, just as Nakahara Chuya could not comprehend Yakimaru's obsession. Language is the path through which humans communicate, but when that ability is lost, two people are destined to be enemies. After a long standoff, the hope in Nakahara Chuya's eyes dimmed. It's still no use. He couldn't find a better way, only feeling as if his soul was exposed under Yakimaru's gaze, as though it stripped away the human exterior, revealing a core filled with an unbearable, corrupted force. He reluctantly took a few steps back. Yakimaru. That's your name, right? I am Nakahara Chuya. The fiery-haired youth stared intently at Yakimaru, and though he was born far from human, the sincerity in his demeanor had not faded. Until we meet again. Next time, he was determined to find a way to communicate. A few days later, after much deliberation, the Armed Detective Agency received a familiar anonymous request. The client did not appear in person, and a third party had paid part of the commission in advance. The only request was to find a way to communicate with someone who was both blind and deaf, so that person wouldn't continue to see them as an enemy. Kunikita Dalpo pondered, the description sounds a bit familiar. The other members of the Armed Detective Agency exchanged strange looks, recalling that mentally exhausting day. Edogawa Ranpo, holding the request form, couldn't stop laughing. With pinpoint accuracy, he commented, he wants to communicate with Yakimaru, but Yakimaru sees him as an enemy. Currently, the agency was giving its full attention to any request, and Fukuzawa Yukichi, taking the matter seriously, stepped forward. Ranpo, do you have a solution? Of course, this great detective does. Edogawa Ranpo, completely unbothered, adjusted his glasses for Fukuzawa's sake, adopting a confident pose and flashing a grin that reflected the brilliance gifted to him by the heavens. Don't kill people, do more good deeds, and slowly clear your name. The president is the best example of this. Otherwise, Ranpo doubted Yakimaru could have restrained himself during their first encounter. That boy. He seems to be the bane of all evil. And that was it. When Nakahara Chuya received the response from the Armed Detective Agency, he felt a sense of despair. Do more good deeds. One of the Suribachi Street residents, acting as an intermediary, carefully said, Sheep King, they said, you should do more good deeds, avoid killing people, and over time, you won't be hated anymore. Nakahara Chuya looked back at him with confused eyes. Is that even possible? I think the Sheep King, who often helps children and drives away bad people, is already a good person. The residents of Suribachi Street feared his power, but they approved of his actions. Caught off guard by the sudden praise, Nakahara Chuya's ears flushed red. Flustered, he stammered, I didn't. I was just doing what I could, after all, I grew up on Suribachi Street too. At 14, it's such a good age. Life hasn't taken shape yet, full of endless hopes and possibilities. The residents of Suribachi Street could now see from his reaction that the powerful Sheep King was, after all, just a child. At the Port Mafia headquarters, Tezuka Osamu, ever since bringing Yakimaru back, hadn't let him act alone anymore. At this moment, he sat in a chair, resting his chin on his hand, bored as he counted through a pile of books on the table, Psychological Analysis of Disabled Individuals, Communication Guidance for the Deaf and Mute, A Scientific Guide to Human Organs, 100 Classic Scenes to Frighten the Soul, on the Manufacture of Prosthetics, and The History of Ability Organizations Around the World. Among the stack of books, it seemed like there was a strange one mixed in. In the cell that restrained ability users, Yumino Kyusaku tossed a doll into Yakimaru's hands. Big puppet brother, look. My doll looks just like you. Yumino Kyusaku's life flame burned with a red glow, and at its core was a tiny speck of white. This was a child in the truest sense. Yakimaru, having reviewed the contents of Dogra Magra, had grown more resistant to mental attacks. He was now able to distinguish part of his consciousness from hallucinations, even as he held the doll with no real sense of touch. The Dogra Magra's medium was the doll itself. As long as the doll existed, so did Yumino Kyusaku's power. The threads of ability from Yakimaru connected to the child. He quietly stroked the doll. Yumino Kyusaku was overjoyed. After so many years of loneliness, no one had dared to come near him. Big puppet brother can play with me, just like the stuffed animals my mom and dad gave me. Before his unsettling words could continue, Yumino Kyusaku was hit on the head with a book, wincing in pain as he clutched his head. Dazai Osamu, looking down at him with a fake smile, said, "I can play with you too." Tears welled up in Yumino Kyusaku's eyes as he whimpered, "Bandage brother is mean." Dazai Osamu picked up another even thicker book, weighing it in his hand with the clear intention of repeating the action if necessary. Yumino Kyusaku pouted and quietly inched closer to Yakimaru for comfort. However, Yakimaru, disliking the red glow emanating from him, coldly and indifferently shifted to sit nearer to Dazai Osamu. Dazai Osamu casually grabbed the doll from Yakimaru's arms, causing it to vanish, thus dispelling the ability Dogra Magra. Yakimaru lifted his head and seemed to look in the direction of Dazai Osamu, who was seated in the chair. The hallucinations faded bit by bit from his mind. The world was in chaos, and the myriad faces of humanity faded from his sight, colors draining away from everything. As time passed, everything dimmed. His mind, after enduring repeated assaults from Dogra Magra, returned once more to a life shrouded in darkness. He whispered within his heart, using a voice he had long forgotten belonged to whom. "I still know pain, I still remember colors, I have conquered my fear of the dark." Light made people weak, while darkness had become his shield. But I still long to return to the world of light. The ephemeral consciousness within the puppet's form suddenly grew stronger, refusing to release its grip on the world around it. The intertwined red and white flames burned fiercely, growing with each passing moment, unwilling to be extinguished in the darkness. It was like the ultimate desire of human nature. Yakimaru's existence symbolized the primal yearning for survival at the very essence of life. Dazai Osamu watched closely as subtle changes occurred in Yakimaru's body, listening to the powerful rhythm of his heartbeat, lost in the sensation. Still alive, huh? Such willpower reminded him of an ever-burning flame of life. Just like this summer. A bit too warm. Chapter 19 End.